Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you for the invitation to speak at McMaster. I think we need new ways of thinking and talking about migration and labour, and to do that we really do need to go back to basics. The politics of migration in many states goes to put it quite simplistically, like this: we want the brightest and the best, otherwise migrants will take the jobs which should be filled by unemployed citizens, or they'll take benefits which they've not properly paid into. This is quite simply not the case. There's not a set number of jobs in the economy, and it's usually very difficult for non-citizens to claim social benefits. And of course, national welfare states are not only built on the contribution of citizens. But these are complicated arguments, and the more typical response to these kinds of points, including, not only, but including from migrants and their supporters, can be, but migrants do the so-called 3D, dirty, demeaning and dangerous jobs that non-migrants don't want to do. This speaks to representations of the good, hard-working immigrant and resonates with employers who in many different countries voice similar concerns about the laziness of native workers and the exemplary values of certain nationalities of migrants. So these kinds of claims are problematic because they don't speak to the different constraints operating on low-wage citizens and migrant workers, and because they overlook the struggles of non-migrant working people, including citizens of colour. Low-wage citizens, particularly women, are rarely able to pick and choose their work, and in richer states can often be subject to very demeaning processes in order to claim minimal welfare benefits. So these kinds of arguments that migrants do the 3D jobs can contribute to driving a wedge between people who are subject to different forms of marginalisation and who are therefore often positioned as being in competition for social and economic resources, including low-wage jobs. So what I want to rescue, though, from this rather sterile debate is a sense that we can change the future. At a time of climate crisis and techno-determinism, there is a temptation to just give up and let whatever happens take its course. But actually, in public debate, that doesn't happen with reference to migration. So we can see that the future isn't just something to forecast, something that will happen as we watch, but rather as a project that we are all engaged in, like it or not. So in this presentation, I want to, I'm afraid, start by talking about Brexit. That's not, I know the UK is not the most important country in the world, but you will appreciate it's hard to kind of get your head around anything at the moment in the UK without thinking about Brexit. So I put in Brexit, a cautionary tale into Google, and I got 131,000 hits. So there's obviously quite a lot of cautionary tales we can get from Brexit. We don't know what the future, the current process, what the outcome will be, and it does, I think, contain some seeds of transformatory change. But what we do know is, as Judy intimated, that we're experiencing a lot of polarisation, division and racism in our politics that is profoundly troubling. So I'm going to describe, following David Andres, how the referendum vote was driven by a fear of migration that is a manifestation of cultural dementia. And as someone with a very dear and close relative who suffers from dementia, I don't use that term lightly. The Brexit mess exemplifies where tangled up migration politics can lead. So to untangle it, I emphasise the importance of introducing history and political economy into our thinking about migration. I'll also argue that if we examine the vexed question of who counts as a migrant, we find that the boundary between the migrant and the citizen is much more fuzzy than we might think. And I'll give some examples of ways in which immigration controls and enforcement, far from protecting citizens, can actually exclude them. I'll then look at some ways in which we can move beyond assumptions about migrants and citizens being in competition for the privileges of membership suggesting, for example, that the way that time is controlled through contracts and through access to welfare benefits and the ideal of the worker citizen are ways in which, in practice, we can use the same lens to look at both migrants and particularly low-waged and unemployed citizens. So, to start off with the cautionary tale. Fear and hostility to immigration was one of the key factors in the UK's vote to leave the European Union. But importantly, this was not a new phenomenon. Immigration in the UK has been an issue of political salience for many years. Surveys have been asking the British public about their attitudes to immigration for over 50 years. Between 1964 and 1975, about 85% of respondents to the British election survey felt there were too many immigrants in Britain. And I think what's interesting to note about this survey is that for many years at the beginning, they didn't ask so-called coloured respondents. So there's something here, I think, telling us about the relation between race and immigration that isn't acknowledged. But this poll is an Ipsos Mori poll. So Ipsos Mori run a monthly public opinion survey where they ask respondents to name the most important issues facing the country. And again, so they don't sort of give you a list. They just ask what you think are the most important issues. And interestingly, until January 2015, if the respondent said race relations or something to do with racism, that was again lumped in with immigration. So again, I think this is telling us something about the people designing the survey and the relation between immigration and race. So what you can see from this, I don't know why I've highlighted the NHS one, but this is basically, it's this line is immigration. So here's just before the EU referendum. So you can see that it was becoming a very salient issue facing the country, and it actually became a very self-fulfilling prophecy, because as governments perceived failure to deal with immigration and to respond to problems, to anxieties about immigration, became itself a cause of concern. So then it became this kind of vicious circle. And this anxiety is reflected in and promoted by a sharp increase in newspaper coverage, which rose significantly from 2012 on, with the most common word associated with migration. So some colleagues have kind of looked at what words, what adjectives are used to describe immigration. By far the most common word that prefixed migration was the word mass. So it was mass migration. The focus in this period was very much on economic migrants. So in the kind of early 2000s, the focus had been on asylum seekers, so-called bogus asylum seekers and refugees. But this kind of switched, especially around sort of 2005 onwards, to be about economic migrants. And there was considerable fear pumped up about migrants taking jobs from UK nationals. So in the media discourse, hostility to migrants had to be seen as very different from racism. To say that you think there are too many black and Asian people in England on the television is not acceptable. To say you think there are too many migrants is. The fact that hostility to migrants and migration was seen very much in terms of hostility to European migration, which is coded as white, was taken to mean that this was a very different matter to racism. So it was, oh, at last we can talk about migration and that we think it's a problem without being accused of being racist. We don't like migrants. The migrants we don't like are white. Black and minority ethnic people, lots of them don't like migrants. Therefore, our antipathy to migrants is not racist. That's kind of putting it crudely, but that's more or less how it ran. So Nigel Farage, but I like to call him Farage, who was then leader of UKIP, said apropos of immigration and Brexit that leaving the EU would allow more black people to enter the UK, and that he wanted, and I quote, to ensure that highly skilled people from the Commonwealth, from India, Canada, New Zealand and beyond, and I was thinking, wow, where's beyond New Zealand? That's pretty far away, get a fair chance to get into Britain, unlike now where we give precedence via our open border with the European Union to 500 million people from Europe and former communist countries. Note here I'm talking about what was said in the press. On the streets, hostility to migrants does not observe these niceties. In 2016, the government itself linked the Brexit vote to the largest spike in recorded race hate crimes seen since records began. So the Brexit referendum is an example of how migration can become a lightning rod for grievances about austerity, poverty, lack of voice, and many other issues. Migrants have become emblematic of centralised state power, in hoc to business, human rights and bureaucratic interests, and of mainstream politicians' disengagement with everyday problems. But this lightning rod phenomenon doesn't simply happen. In the UK, it occurs in the context of what David Andres has described as cultural dementia, the forgetting of the past or its half-remembering, resulting in a deep confusion about one's present. The responses to migration are a manifestation of that dementia as a terrible disconnect between the past, the present, and the future that pervades the contemporary politics of migration. The right, typically negative about labour rights or social security, claim to be the standard bearers of the working class when it comes to migration. Here, in fact, we can see a prefiguring of the anti-elite rhetoric that has become such a feature of public debate in the UK and also in the United States today. So in this, they call on the past of the golden age of the welfare state. So this is kind of, I think, how this sort of Brexit is framed, ignoring both that this ran alongside the demise of the formal empire, but also that, as Rhodes Professor of Imperial History Richard Drayton explains, when British democracy created the welfare state, it depended on the invisible donations from tea pickers in Ceylon, rubber tappers in Malaya, gold miners in South Africa, copper miners in Rhodesia, the oil of Iraq, and especially Iran. The children of those tea pickers, rubber tappers, and so on are unlikely to be able to access the welfare state in the United Kingdom today. So that's the kind of cultural dementia of the right. So the left, so that the sorts of arguments that the left then responds with is, interestingly, in the same way that the right doesn't normally talk about the rights of working class people, the left doesn't normally talk about productivity and efficiency, but when it comes to migration, they move to promoting the economic value of immigration. And in their efforts to take the sting out of it and make migration not disruptive, attempt to depoliticize it. Don't worry, not many will come, or migrants are good for the economy, means that history is eschewed in favour of technocracy and making migration work for Britain. So the return to the past is not, in this case, to the Trente Glorieuses of the welfare state, but to the 1990s, when empire was set firmly in the past. So at the moment, dementia is not yet curable. But I do think that there is the beginnings of the cure for cultural dementia. A good dose of history, laced with political economy, can help to put us right. We have the medicine in books like Nandita Sharma's Home Rule, coming out in February next year, and I know Nandita spoke yesterday, the day before yesterday, here at McMaster. In the UK, we've moved from a hope that the British Empire will be gently disarmed by the passing of time to the aggressive promotion of post-Brexit Empire 2.0. So that was how Brexit was being imagined a couple of years ago. We're going to go back or we're going to go forward to Empire 2.0 that relies on a nationalist and fictitious history of a glorious past that imagines empire as sealed up nation states rather than expansion and domination. This finds ready consumers on the doorstep, and I can say this as actually somebody that did kind of hold my nose, so I held my nose and I campaigned to remain in the EU, even though I think there's a lot of problems with the EU, so I did a lot of knocking on doors. And actually I found very kind of explicitly what Paul Gilroy has talked about as post-colonial melancholia. A yearning for a time when Britain, or England more specifically, was great, the consequence of a loss of empire both unmourned and unreconciled. So on the one hand, you had this kind of post-colonial melancholia, but this was also in a context of a world where offshoring has become a major feature of the global economy. So there's been a huge shift in manufacturing from the global north to low-wage countries. And in a world of breathtaking inequality, whereas John Smith has demonstrated, so this is his table, his chart, goods are affordable for low-waged workers and non-workers in richer countries only because of a system of resource extraction, outsourcing and arm's-length super-exploitation in the global south. But there are some production processes that cannot be moved. Agriculture is tied to land, which is fixed. Construction has to be in place. Care work, largely, has to be in place. And this is particularly true for certain kinds of service and social reproduction. So these are the very same jobs where we find workers from the global south coming to work. Attention has been fixated on the movement of capital and production to low-waged workers, but not connected the migration of low-waged workers to wealthy countries, the pincer movement of global labour arbitrage. So we have these two, we have not just the movement of migrants to wealthy countries, but we also have offshoring, and people don't tend to connect those two or to see that these are actually related. So if we're thinking in this way, both globally and historically, about capital and labour, we can't take as our starting point an assumed difference between migrants and citizens. Rather, I think we have to ask, when does being a migrant matter? In fact, who counts as a migrant? And this is very important in a debate which is completely fixated on numbers. It's not just that in such a politically important field we can't rely on we all know who we mean, but also that if we think about who counts as a migrant, we can get to some of the underlying concerns and logics about the migration debate and how states respond. So I would say, crudely, that there are three types of migrant. The migrant in data, the migrant in law, and the migrant in public debate. So, and that these three kinds of migrants are not all talking about the same people. So in data sets, migrants can be defined by their foreign birth, or by their foreign citizenship, or by their movement into a new country to stay for a period of time. So that's LTIM, long-term international migrant. That's generally how the UN defines a migrant. If you are moving from your country of usual residence to a new country and you're planning to stay there for 12 months or longer, then under that definition, you count as a migrant. So you have these three different ways in the data of defining a migrant. And actually, quantitative analysts and policymakers typically opt for foreign birth because it's relatively stable, because you can't change where you're born. But actually, the problem with these definitions is that all of them can actually apply to citizens. So they mean different things. Hang on, sorry, I'm not being very clear. But basically, headlines like that Daily Express headline, 1.7 million new jobs and 92% go to migrants. So in that headline, they're using as their definition of migrant foreign-born. In this chart, which is from a UN chart, number of international migrants in 2017 is using as its definition someone who is moving away from their usual country of residence. Now, both of these definitions can apply to citizens. So you can be a migrant in the first of these definitions, and you can actually be a naturalised person, somebody who's got citizenship, who's lived in the country for years. This LTIM definition, if you're Canadian and you've gone to Japan to work for 4 years, and then you're returning to Canada, so you're planning on being in Canada and spending the rest of your life in Canada, then, but under this LTIM definition, you count as a migrant. So when you look at the numbers, when you look at UN statistics about how many people are moving about, when you look at sort of headlines, it's really important to think about the definition of who counts as a migrant and to recognise that actually this does also include citizens, which is actually a problem for policy, right? Because immigration law and immigration enforcement it's difficult to control who's coming in and who's coming out if actually you're talking about citizens. But these are also different from who counts as a migrant in public debate. In public debate, if you're in London, a US banker is not going to count as a migrant. A black woman who's cleaning the house of a US banker will often count as a migrant, even if she has a British passport. So there's also the question of who counts as a migrant in public debate. So these kinds of migrants, the migrant in data, the migrant in law, and the migrant in public debate, they're talking about very often different people, different kinds of people. And now I'm not going to go into it, but maybe we can in the kind of Q&A, but also who counts as a worker is also quite tricky. It's not as easy as one might think. So in this case, who counts as a migrant worker then becomes even more complicated. So just to give you an example of how this can play out in some interesting ways, states all over the world offer visa schemes which are aimed at facilitating temporary youth mobility. It's actually really interesting. If you look at these visa schemes, you can see they're completely kind of exploding. And it's not just Canada, Australia and the UK, but just to give some examples, China, Chile, Peru, Ukraine, Thailand, South Africa and Russia all have these kinds of schemes, sometimes described as working holidaymaker arrangements. So these represent working as a fun pursuit. So this was one of the illustrations. If you want to apply for a working holidaymaker visa to come to Canada, this is what you're going to be doing. Doesn't look much like working to me. So it presents working as supplementary to living rather than being the purpose of your visit. So the purpose of your visit is about getting experience, language, soft skills, flexible thinking, yada yada. Visas are usually valid for 2 years or less and usually not renewable. Healthy, single and young, this migration is not a problem. Mobile youth might work, but they're imagined very differently from economic migrants, even if in practice they look very like seasonal and temporary workers. So, and I think actually this might be one of the things that, routes that the UK will go down post-Brexit will be much more of these, well, we don't have to worry about these kinds of schemes. They're not really migrant workers. So what does this confusion about who counts as a migrant and a migrant worker mean for migration politics? It indicates, I think, that the migrant and the citizen are not so easily distinguishable, and that we can't assume, therefore, that what is bad for migrants is good for citizens, an assumption on which immigration politics is often based. After all, if we don't know exactly who a migrant is, then neither do we know exactly who a citizen is. If I skipped a slide, I think, yeah. Some of those with the legal status of citizens become migrants in data set, but they can also become migrants in public debate and in research with the everyday terminology of second-generation migrant or person of migration heritage, who sheds and who retains their migrancy is often bound up with nationally specific ways of encoding and remaking race. Racialized differentiations can be highly relevant in popular identifications of migrant overriding legal status and other forms of belonging. In work on the US by the legal scholar Jacqueline Stevens, she found that thousands of US citizens have been illegally deported, and that typically these deported citizens share characteristics with people who are recognised as vulnerable to signing false confessions, black with poor literacy and mental health challenges. The imbrication between migration and race is vividly illustrated in the UK, where responsibility for immigration enforcement has been rolled out to a wide range of different non-immigration actors, including employers and landlords. And these consequences of immigration checks and enforcement are felt much more strongly by black than white people, as we saw in April 2018, when the UK was hit by the so-called Windrush scandal. The lives of large numbers of black British citizens who had lived in the UK since the 90s were destroyed, evicted, denied medical treatment, refused entry, summarily sacked, detained, because they were unable to demonstrate their citizenship. Actually, and this has been going on for a long time, so I can say with my own experience, my mum, who retired in 1994, was unable to claim her NHS pension for 2 years because she didn't have her naturalisation certificate from the 1940s. So while the Windrush scandal has been, has highlighted this, it's actually been going on for a long time. So immigration policy is of import to citizens, as we discover with the Windrush. But citizens are also affected by immigration law as a consequence of the requirement to enforce. And in many states, the criminalisation of citizens via immigration laws has been increasing. Across Europe, there's been a significant rise in what the French call délits de solidarité, or crimes of solidarity. Criminal laws designed to target organised crime and profiteers are being applied to fit an anti-migrant agenda. Those who assist people who cross borders are being accused of smuggling, trafficking, and being slave traders. Sea rescue, giving lifts to people within as well as across borders, provision of food and water and medical care are all becoming offences. So these kinds of measures hit citizens who are engaged in migration politics. But non-activist citizens too can find their lives disrupted by immigration conditions and enforcement. In the UK, we've seen drivers, administrators, public service providers required to check that people are complying with immigration requirements. And these in practice often end up being the responsibility of the lowest paid. So it's something that I'm very aware of in universities, where university lecturers also have a requirement to conduct registrations in order to ensure that student visa holders are kind of turning up for lectures. And sometimes academics are very unhappy about checking their students' right to study, in which case it ends up being low-waged workers, secretaries and support staff who end up having to do the state dirty work. But there are also the income demands, which are now standard across most EU member states, that require citizens to have minimum earnings before being able to be joined by so-called third country nationals, so that's non-EU citizens, partners, and by their children. So in the UK, nearly 2/3 of British women in employment do not earn enough to be joined by a third country national partner. You have to earn £18,300, which is not very much, but they don't earn enough to be joined by a partner. So a right to family life that has been denied low-waged or unemployed citizens, whatever their ethnic background. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, I think, about all of this is that it hits low-wage people, and it also hits people from wherever they come from. So Canada being actually a case in point. So This was a case where they were unable to be. They had problems with visas because they weren't earning enough. And there's this kind of sense that this is not really supposed to be applying to us. You know, there's this sense, and it's right? It's not supposed to be applying to people from Canada, people from Australia, but the fact is it does, because if you don't earn enough, then it's tough, doesn't matter where you come from. So the current obsession with immigration as a problem turns attention away from gendered, classed and racialised borders within citizenship, but actually immigration enforcement is a mechanism that helps to create differentiated citizenship. So it bears down disproportionately not only on black and minority ethnic citizens, but also on citizens who are unemployed or who are low-waged. So the other thing that we've seen in the UK is how the negativity associated with the word migrant has been harnessed to direct hostility, not only at black and minority ethnic citizens, but also white majority citizens who move. New arrivals to certain towns are also turned into migrants. So this is some graffiti that just came up last week in Lewis, where there's been a spate of far-right violence, and including the daubing of anti-Semitic slogans, and this one, kill a DFL. DFL means down from London. So this is not only also about far-right thugs. The Localism Act has given considerable powers to local authorities to determine who is eligible for social housing, meaning that local authorities have produced social housing allocation policies. And in some of these social housing allocation policies, migrants are they're associated with all the usual problems. They're just taking housing from locals, they're bringing drugs and crime and, you know, the sorts of things that we all know about. But what is interesting here is that migrant means anyone who is crossing a local authority boundary. That is, people who have the legal status of citizens. In some cases, in order to be eligible to get on the social housing waiting list, so not even to actually get social housing, but to be eligible to go on the waiting list, the local authority will produce complicated behavioural conditions, including things like, if you're unemployed, volunteering for a certain number of hours a week, even going to the gym, giving up smoking. These kinds of requirements are being put on people in order to be eligible to join the social housing list. So like applicants, I think this is actually akin to naturalisation, right? It's like applicants for naturalisation, you have to prove that you're a good citizen, the right kind of person. So in this way, citizens are turned into migrants in policy. Furthermore, while a citizen may have the legal right to be present on the territory, that does not give citizens the right to be in any public space, especially if they are marginal people in prime places. In many countries in Europe, this is done by local authorities. The homeless and those who beg are continually negotiating public space, and they can be moved on or punished for staying still as well as being mobile. So this isn't to deny that being a migrant, and I put this in inverted commas for reasons that you'll appreciate, so this isn't to deny that being a migrant in terms of being subject to immigration controls matters considerably. Immigration controls are not simply a mechanism that facilitates the entry of a particular kind of human being called a migrant worker, but they actually contribute to favouring certain kinds of workers and making certain kinds of employment relationships. For example, in liberal democracies, it's generally not acceptable under employment and gender discrimination law to require that job applicants not have children, or be a certain age, or be born in a certain country. Yet this is exactly what immigration rules governing workers often do. So effectively, they create pools of applicants who fit certain demographic characteristics, including, I think, importantly, not having the drag of family relationships. They also contribute to the creation of hierarchies of nationality and employment by pushing some nationalities into irregular work through making certain visas available to only certain countries of origin. So that's before you get in. Then after you get in, being subject to immigration controls impacts on a range of your rights, and it impacts on social relations. In systems where citizens can sponsor migrants as employees and partners, for example, it makes for more compliant workers and spouses. Employers all over the world praise migrants' work ethic and contrast it with lazy citizens. In fact, I did some work where we looked at employers and workers before and after EU enlargement in 2004. And when we interviewed the employers about so before we EU enlargement, we asked, why are you hiring Polish workers or Czech workers or whatever? And they would say, oh, their culture, really hard working, much better than British people who won't get out of bed in the morning. And then we interviewed those same employers 18 months after EU enlargement. So EU enlargement, which was effectively then both a regularisation for EU nationals and also meant that they were no longer dependent on employers for their visas. And those same employers were like, oh, the Polish, they've just become like the Brits. They've just got, their culture's been damaged, and now we need Ukrainians because they're the hardworking types. So there's a real kind of compliance that comes with this kind of visa dependence, and employment conditions in practice are often regulated not through employment law but through immigration requirements associated with visa conditions and the bilateral MOUs that govern immigration and trade between particular states. In countries where there is a subsistence safety net, this is often not available to low-wage non-citizen residents, or in the case of the EU and its member states, available only on a very temporary and highly restrictive basis. So that's another indirect means of tying workers into poor work. Immigration controls can effectively enforce temporary contracts through renewal restrictions and basically make explicit demands of prospective workers that it wouldn't be possible to make of citizen workers. So while immigration controls are often depicted as a means of protecting so-called low-skilled jobs for so-called low-skilled citizens, in practice, they can make migrants more desirable workers as they give employers additional means of control that they don't have over citizens. So migration is one of the multiple ways in which people's movement has been guided and constrained over the centuries. Even before the introduction of welfare states, in many European citizens, poor relief was limited to parish residents, and the poor were liable, like the poor today, like the beggars, like the homeless, were liable to be moved on if there was any suggestion that they might become unemployed or stay long enough to make a claim on the parish or have a baby that would be born in the parish and therefore be the parish's responsibility. So in the same way, immigration restrictions seek to tie certain people to places. And what are immigration controls but attempts to control the mobility of the poor? In his 2011 book, The Haves and the Have-Nots, World Bank economist Branko Milanovic calculates having an average income of $34,000 a year pushes you into the top 1% of global income earners. $34,000 a year is not an exceptionally high income, and it's actually gone down. It's actually been decreasing in recent years because of the increasing inequality. Is not an exceptionally high income, even in countries with free healthcare and secondary education. Milanovic also estimates approximately 3/4 of inequality can be attributed to between to between country differences. So I think we need to understand immigration within this context and analyse immigration as part of a gamut of measures that are used to control the mobility of the poor, whatever their citizenship. So also control like social housing, as we see in the UK, the ways in which if you want to make welfare benefit claims, you have to be prepared to travel certain distances. So there's lots of ways in which actually the movement of people are subject to control. And I think we need to be thinking about making the connections between immigration controls and these other forms of control of movement in order to get a better understanding of how this works. Because it's precisely the low-waged and the unemployed that we're told immigration controls and enforcement is designed to protect. The middle class might want the migrant baristas for their coffee bars, but the pain of this is borne by the unemployed and the workers. So that's very much the discourse in the UK. But what this kind of assertion does is it misses the connections between exclusions within citizenship and exclusions from citizenship, which means that there is a potential to complicate arguments that set up a homogenised so-called migrant in conflict with a homogenised working class. One way of connecting these exclusions, the exclusions from formal citizenship that we see with those subject to immigration controls, with these exclusions of differentiated citizenship, is to make visible the worker citizen. There's been a long history of attributing a strong moral value to labour from all sides of the political spectrum. Unemployed citizens are often considered not mobile enough, stuck in housing estates or rural areas, not prepared to get on their bike or on a train. They've got to be prodded off their sofas and into employment. These prods can be delivered by welfare benefit requirements, which, as I say, require you to travel a certain distance to work. But then at the same time, moving around too much can raise issues when you want to apply for welfare benefits. So then you start getting counted as a migrant by the local authority. So what we've seen in the European Union, I would argue, is that access to the welfare state has replaced the levers of immigration controls as a way of controlling the mobility of certain types of EU citizens. While citizens enjoy free movement, the right to stay for longer than 3 months if you are not a student or wealthy or self-employed is dependent on working. To deter non-earning people who do not have the resources to support themselves, complex restrictions on access to certain non-contributory benefits are imposed. And importantly, these restrictions also apply to returning nationals. So in the UK, if people come back, British citizens who come back, from who come back to the UK post-Brexit are going to find that there are welfare benefits that they assume they're going to be eligible for as citizens. They're going to find that they're not eligible for them. So, and I think this gives us a clue as to how we can connect citizens and migrants, another way that we can connect citizens and migrants. Because the problem for returning UK nationals hit by Brexit will basically be they've been away from the UK for too long. So time away, the length of time you are away, matters. So let's think about time, because the ways in which states exercise control over time is absolutely crucial to immigration controls and also to the ways that the border moves inside the territory. So there's been recently a literature developing on time and immigration controls and the ways in which states impose temporal limitations on residents through visas. And the ways in which also bureaucracies subject applicants to long periods of uncertainty and suspense. So while migration researchers tended to focus on movement across space, there is, in the past few years, been a lot more attention spent on looking at the different ways in which time matters. But importantly, it's not just the lives of the mobile that are temporally governed. And in fact, we are seeing too that citizens are experiencing temporal shifts. The idea of an overly powerful present and prolonged youth for people with uncertain futures has been noted by researchers across the world, who have found increasing numbers of people subject to chronic waiting, where the access to social goods, economic resources, and settling in some way is always coming soon, but never quite there. Even in wealthy countries, as jobs become more precarious, homes more expensive, pensions more fragile, the sense of permanent temporariness and unsettlement is more pervasive. Bound up with this, of course, is precarious work. And again, state institutionalisation of precarity through law deserves our attention. Precarity does not just happen. Despite their apparently marginal status, qualifying periods, so that's the amount of time you have to be in a job before you can qualify for certain rights, have become a key part of the legal apparatus that enable and encourage the structural expansion of contingent employment. Workers who have not been employed for longer than a certain period of time cannot make certain kinds of claims on an employer, and qualifying periods structure the standard employment relationship for migrants and for citizens alike. Qualifying periods also feature strongly in welfare state regimes. So how about if we foreground time as a boundary around access to rights rather than citizenship per se? I think this has the potential to recalibrate some of our assumptions about the relation between the citizen and the migrant and the functioning of immigration controls and welfare benefits. Perhaps we can think of migrants as at the sharpest end of the temporal restrictions that surround access to rights for citizens as well as for foreigners. So trying to see how can we use the same lens to look at migrants and citizens rather than assuming that they're different, but also what can we learn from the experiences of migrants that is important and of relevance to citizens. Promises of strong control over immigration appeal to the hope of a national labour market and economy, a stable, cohesive national society, and representative democratic politics. Hopes for an income, security, stability, and voice are eminently understandable, but they won't be attained by exerting ever tighter control over immigration. Indeed, the risk is that the obsession engendered by immigration only increases exploitation in the labour market, destabilises neighbourly relations, and caricatures democratic politics. That is certainly what we see in our demented politics of Brexit. In Britain, as in many other European countries today, the challenge is to draw out the connections between crises of increasing poverty and associated popular anger and resentment on the one hand, and immigration and controls on the other. The coupling of economic squeeze and immigration is always in danger of being reduced to a simple message. We have to look after our own first. We've got to first attend to housing, benefit, health needs of our population. Sorry, there's just not enough to go around. The we here that has to look after our own first is the citizen talking across the border. But it also, in addresses within the border, the we can be the taxpayer or the residents in the municipality or homeowners. If only we could stop these people coming, everything would be okay. But to get back to my cautionary tale, what we've seen since the referendum has been a big shift, a segue. In fact, we've moved from talking about immigration and taking back control to talking about trade deals. The point of Brexit is no longer, it seems, to stop immigration, but to facilitate trade deals with non-European partners, and particularly with the biggest and the bestest trade dealer of all, the United States. And as the UK government documents confirm, those hardest hit in these trade deals will be the low-waged and the unemployed, sealed into the nation state. So this, I would contend, suggests that we must understand and reconnect our politics so that we can understand better what is bad for migrants is not good for citizens, but very often it ends up being bad for citizens as well. Thank you.
Would you like to take questions?
I'm going to ask a question of the audience. Can I ask?
Yes, please.
So I'm just interested in how these kind of arguments sound to a Canadian audience. So I'm very conscious of the fact, for example, that you have different provinces and how immigration and labour sort of move between provinces is quite different from the UK. It's also Canada is represented as being a country which is much more pro-migration than the UK, which I suspect is not necessarily true. So I'm just kind of interested in, does this have any resonance, or does it sound like it's a completely different universe?
Stephen Harper's government imposed longer travel requirements in the East Coast for unemployed people who sought employment insurance benefits because foreign workers, temporary foreign workers, were coming in to take their jobs. They were taking the jobs, and lazy Canadians were collecting unemployment and weren't traveling. So we increased the requirements for traveling in the Maritimes under the guise that if we made the lazy Canadians work, we wouldn't have to hire temporary foreign workers. And that's still part of the rule. So that's an example. Does anyone else?
I actually have a question.
Yes, please.
This discussion. Thanks so much for your talk. It was amazing. And I think that just in terms of how you described how a migrant is viewed in terms of data, law, and public debate, I'm kind of just wondering how that sort of sits within the perspective of the migrant themselves. Like, how do they differentiate? I mean, I was at a talk yesterday where a lot of people were sort of talking about how people in Canada are voting for conservative governments from migrant backgrounds, and how do they self-differentiate then where they've become the citizen and the other is the migrant, and so on. I mean, I don't know if I formulated this right, but yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things, obviously, there's lots of different kinds of migrant. I mean, there's not a single thing one could say. But I think two things. So one is that, there is this, and this is again where time matters, right? It's like, these new ones are spoiling it for us. We were the good Iraqis or Filipinos, and we didn't come in the cheating way, and now these people are coming in and they're spoiling it for the rest of us. I think you do kind of hear that kind of thing. But the other thing that I'm really picking up that I think is really interesting and important is actually this rejection, in fact, of the idea of being a migrant at all. Like this idea that that actually, because the terminology is in fact so hostile, that it's not a neutral word. So people are saying, we're internationals, so there's kind of this grasp for another kind of way of describing who it is that because the other thing that I think is interesting is, I would say, the beginnings of a shift also of moving away from, I'm French or I'm Greek or what. So there's also a kind of recognition of something that is shared between different nationalities, but also of wanting to avoid both. Also asylum seekers and refugees, wanting to avoid asylum seeker, refugees and migrants, and looking for new kinds of words. So I was actually at this really interesting talk that was given by somebody that was saying in New York, and she was saying, oh, we don't, to work with people in detention, and she said, oh, we don't use the term migrant or refugee, we use the term friend. And it was quite interesting because actually then she was talking about it in a very unaffected way. So, and I was thinking, oh, my response when she's talking about friends in detention is quite different than if she was talking about migrants in detention. Now, of course, I don't know whether I want to be friends with everyone, so, but I think it shows you the power of these, it does show you the power of these words.
We're talking country to country or within countries, but it strikes me that with the climate emergency, there are migrants who are moving from rural to urban as the land dries up, the stocks, and there's that migration shift into cities, chasing water, all that kind of stuff, which is kind of loading the gun, particularly in poorer places. But I would think we're going to have that here. You know.
I think that's a really important point, because I think that, so in fact I've just finished doing a paper on domestic labour, which is looking at saying, you know, actually in many countries of the world there's been a move, you know, for centuries from rural to urban centres. Again, that is not that, and that movement is not connected with the word with international migration now, but actually the hostility of that was experienced by rural to urban people and the kind of negativity associated with people from the rural hinterlands, I think still has its reflection. You know, you can still see its tail today. So I think. I agree, and I think also so I think that you're also right about climate change, but I think that it's also then connecting it historically to that rural-urban migration is important.
So see there's migrants, immigrants, and migrants, and then with migrants, it's sort of similar. You think of, say, the caribou or something that move and migrate and follow food and stuff like that, or the seasons, and it's sort of a shift as people move around, whether it's within Europe or whatever.
Well, I mean, people move, don't they? Because we're not plants. That's, and then then the question is, when do we give some political? When does this movement become? Is this movement given some political weight? And that doesn't have to be. You don't have to move a long distance for it to be given that political weight. But I think that's what this terminology of migrant does: is it gives the movement a political weight. And I think that's why we have to ask, why is some movement given this political weight and others not?
I think one of the things that's striking about Canada is because we're a young country, we often talk about ourselves as a country of immigrants, as distinguished from the Indigenous people. And so the term settler has been used to describe everyone but the immigrant people. So we're the settlers of Canada, or of this particular space. And that, with a kind of a background of thinking, historically thinking, migrants were the lifeblood of the making of this new country, at least from some perspectives. It makes the anti-migrant sentiment of the moment sort of more acute, and so I don't know if that makes us, or it makes that problem here a little bit different or a little sharper, because it seems as if it's going against, the national kind of legend or myth of, a country of everybody from everywhere kind of thing.
Yeah, so I'd say that there is, it's quite striking it's quite striking coming to North America from Europe, where you see, so terms like indigenous really used by the far right in Europe. You know, it's like you hear it and you're just like, you know, the indigenous people of England, like, that's real, you know, that's really scary. When people start talking about that, that is really scary. So, and the idea of people being native, you know, again, I think also coming from a kind of colonizing place, that's like, well, the natives versus the, you know, so I think this is why history really matters, and I think it's also why when we start our history from also really matters, you know, and think, so I went to this really interesting talk by a deep historian who was interested in why did Homo sapiens move from East Africa when they moved from East Africa? And he said that his argument was it was when containers became, when human beings came to understand the relation of containment. So when they were able to both put things in and carry them, but also put themselves into containers to kind of cross spaces, that was, yeah, anyway, so that's kind of like, okay, because if we hadn't thought of that, then we'd still be in East Africa. So I think thinking about, it's also kind of helpful to think about when we kind of date our movement from.
So you referenced different forms of nationalism throughout the discussion, whether that's the nationalism expressed by Brexit or sort of a desire for the old British Empire. And I'm wondering what you see the role nationalism playing going forward. Is it going to continue to sort of be a negative force on migration? Is there room for it to be a positive influence?
There's no room for it to be a positive influence, I think. I mean, I can't see how you can escape from nationalism as being sort of tying people to territory, and also as being associated with blood and territory, and also once you start that logic, your territory gets smaller and smaller, right? That's what the point of DFL, down from London. So I think that's what we're seeing in the UK now, is that, you know, the spaces within which we are imagining people as belonging is actually kind of shrinking as this kind of shriek of Brexit is becoming louder and louder. So the logic, the kind of exclusionary logic of it is becoming more and more of a problem. Even if you're, you know, so if you're Scottish and you're in England, for example, it's not very nice for you at the moment, you know. So I think, and now this is out of the bottle, it's hard to see how it's going to end. I mean, well, we have to make it end, but it's going to be quite a big job, I think. So I don't think it's going to, I can't see its liberatory, it has no liberatory potential, I don't think.
My question is, so you talk about, I think we can all see nationalism rising globally in the UK, the US, different countries. I was just wondering about immigration controls, if they've actually just heightened in like recent history, because we see like with nationalism, there's growth of immigration controls. If there's been something similar in the past, or is this like something recent or new to history? Does that make sense?
So, well, now I'm conscious that Nandita's in the audience, who knows much more about this than I do. But immigration controls, I mean, they are relatively recent in that, you know, we're talking about, as qua immigration controls, we're talking about the kind of late 19th, early 20th century for their origins. But I think if we relate immigration controls to actually controls over movement, then I think they go back much further. So part of my interest has been to actually think about the control of the movement of vagrants and vagrancy statutes. So if you look in England, which is, I'm afraid, the only space that I know about in this respect, the control of the mobility of the poor began in the 12th century. And actually what you can see there that I think is really interesting was there were three things that that the king was concerned about. One was the price of labour. One was labour markets. One was what they called valiant beggars, so people who were able to work but who were idling. So what I would now say we capture in the welfare state. And the other was what they called masterless men. So people who were roaming about free of their masters, which in a feudal society was obviously very disruptive. So what we would now call social cohesion. So I would say these concerns about labour markets, welfare benefits and social cohesion actually have, if not their origins, at least we can see those anxieties kind of much earlier than immigration controls, and how movement of people was controlled in ways which now can be considered to be very uncivilized. So maybe we'll get to the stage when that's how immigration controls are viewed in 100 years, who knows. So I think that's where I would locate the origins of immigration controls, actually.
I have a question back there and then one over here.
So I think the question of who counts as a migrant is an important one. And so my question is related to that in the sense of who creates or defines the migrant nowadays? Is it the government? Is it academia? Is it general population? Because that's the next question, right? If someone is saying that this is a migrant, who is the authority in being able to define and to a certain degree even create that position?
So what I like about that, so I think that's a good question, and I think, obviously immigration controls and state and press, who have the biggest voice, are very important players, because it's who shouts the loudest, right? But I think what your question also points to is the role of academia in creating the migrant and the role of academic research in creating the migrant. So we're also complicit in this. And so what you see with migration research is that there has been very much a focus on a particular kind of migrant, on the low-waged, on the kind of on the person from the global south. So there has been a very particular idea in migration research on who counts as a migrant, which then contributes to the making of the migrant. And I think that's an important issue for us as academics and researchers to reflect on and to think, well, so how do we then engage politically and ethically, but also epistemologically about this question? If we are actually making a subordinated subject by our research, how do we then escape, how do we not make that subject, or how do we kind of challenge that process? I think that's a very live topic now.
Yes, please.
My question is, how did the migrant situation change pre-EU to now?
So you mean pre-Brexit or pre-joining the EU?
No, pre-joining.
Well, I suppose it depends what you mean by the migrant situation, but what happened when not so much when the UK joined the EU, but when the EU enlarged in 2004, was that there were more people came from the European Union to the UK, but particularly especially actually from Poland. So there'd been quite large communities of EU citizens in the UK before that, but it was the difference was that there were more people came from Poland, but also but it wasn't just the numbers, it was also, as I kind of suggested, that there was that then became a kind of symbol of a lack of sovereignty. So that became a symbol of and as we saw played out with Brexit, that we can't control our borders, that we are that the EU is controlling our laws, that that we are no longer a sovereign nation. So they became a kind of symbol of that. I think that people would. So the anxiety about immigration was almost a reflection of an anxiety about being in the European Union more generally. It became like the concentrated essence of that, I would say.
Could I just ask you, if there was a vote today, would they still vote to leave the EU?
I think it would be a close run thing. I wouldn't, so I think a lot of people think that there would be a vote to remain. I would not say that would be in the bag at all. I would not say that would be in the bag at all. But I do think it's interesting. I do think that it is interesting how the whole conversation has now switched to being about trade and not about being about immigration. That's been quite noticeable.
In your last answer to, not this one, but the one before that, you talked about, you used the word we. And I was curious in listening to your talk that, and it may just be my own particular bias, but it felt that that inherent in what you were saying with regard to both migrants and citizens in the context in which you were describing it, and in particular, low wage earners and unemployed and precarious workers and so on, and migrants, that inherent in your discussion was that the principal antagonist to those people is the nation state. And so I wonder when you talk about we and our attitudes and our feelings, how you make the separation there between the individual ideas of right-wing people or left-wing or whatever, and the nation state itself and its attitudes to these situations.
I'm not quite sure I understand, sorry.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that I felt like that migration itself or immigration and your comparison to citizens within the state, that they faced, those people faced an antagonism from the nation state inherently.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what you, if you did intend that, and how you that almost impossible situation.
Well, so I did intend that. I did intend that. Because I think that when you have nation states, because I don't think you can have just immigration controls. I just think that's a contradiction in terms. And when you have nation states, you have to have immigration controls. You can't have nation states without immigration controls. So even just at that sort of purely logical question. So now that doesn't mean that if we abolish nation states and immigration controls, we will live in a just world, right? Mm-hmm. I think we have to talk about capitalism. I mean, we have to talk about lots of things, of which this is one small thing. But we have to understand, so I think we have to put it within that landscape. And I think we have to, and I think the contradiction, or then the difficulty becomes, right, that's not going to happen tomorrow. in fact, if it did happen tomorrow, we'd be in trouble. So we have to, so then, you know, actually we then are struggling for small things, but with a vision of what the future, of where we want to be, and a vision that is not just like, oh, this is going to be in sort of 1,000 years' time, but we have to be making that as we're doing these small things. But then every time, but we might be doing the small things, and they might be pushing against the vision, right? So you have to think, okay, so people are quite rightly and understandably, and there's no question this is the thing that needs to be done, supporting people in their demands for citizenship, you know, and to get legal status, which is it. Then you can say, well, but that's just basically then you're reaffirming the nation state that you're criticizing. So then we have to think about how do we build a movement, which means that through getting this status, then you don't just get, you know, you then become part of a critical mass of people. So we have to, so that's sort of, that's my sort of ambition or how I kind of imagine that. But I see that contradiction, you know, and it is a very real contradiction. I don't deny that contradiction, but I think, you know, we have to live with it.
That's exactly why I asked the question.
Okay. You spoke about the Polish people coming mainly to Britain. What about all the British people that went to the continent, especially to Spain, Portugal, and France? Do they now have to come back, and do they get repatriated, or do they become migrants?
So that's right. So in some ways, I think it's quite, I was reading some reports saying they're worried about all the British, so basically the largest community of British people in the EU are living in Spain. Most of those are older people. So whereas the EU people in the UK are mainly younger people who are working, the Brits abroad are older people, and they're worried about what's going to happen to the NHS, right? If suddenly all these older people come back and the younger people who are working in the NHS are leaving, how are they going to cope? So what's going to happen to the Brits abroad and to the EU nationals in the UK after Brexit depends on what kind of Brexit we have. So if we have a hard Brexit, if we have a no deal, which I hope we don't, end of October, then everything is up for grabs. Nobody knows. If we have a negotiated deal, even if it's quite a hard Brexit, the rights of the sort of basic rights of EU citizens and UK nationals abroad will be sorted out, so they say. But then we saw that with the Windrush, right? I mean, the problem is, whatever people say, you know, in 40 years' time, if you haven't got the right piece of paper, you could well be in trouble. So there is a lot of anxiety about what the future holds kind of across the board. But I think, as I say, I do think that this question of also the rights of returning UK nationals, which are much more limited. People just assume that they, you know, will have the right to job seekers allowance, and they're going to find that they won't. And who knows the hostility that's going to be faced, you know, if you have large numbers of people returning in a situation where there's been a lot of xenophobia whipped up, who knows what the attitude is going to be to these returning nationals who've been abroad for so long. So it's not good.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm thinking through a few things right now. I guess just this final concluding argument about that you said, like, what's bad for workers is also, or what's bad for migrants is also what's usually bad for citizens. And so I'm just thinking about this, and I don't know, I feel a little uncomfortable with it, I guess, because I mean, is it not enough that a policy or a politics is bad for the migrants themselves? Or if we base our arguments, our migrant justice on, you know, what's also bad for the citizens, is that somehow, is there something problematic about that? I mean, I do appreciate, I think it's important for us to highlight shared struggles and shared histories between oppressed peoples. But I guess part of the concern for me is that if we are, looking at what's bad, who are these policies bad for? Are we still paying enough attention to who the policies are good for? Who's benefiting from oppressing both the migrants and the workers? And are we drawing attention away from capital? And how it is, capital accumulation that's really driving these policies. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I think, so I can see why you said that, but I think that I would say, well, we have to find common interests. We have to be able to demonstrate common interests rather than solidarity. Rather than simple solidarity, I want to show that, it's not just like we're being really nice to you. It's actually that we've got skin in the game here. And I suppose that maybe I would say that definitely I'll think about that, but I think that there's also something about, well, it's when you have those common interests, then you can find who your common enemy is. It's actually the fact that that it's imagined that interests are different that means that it's difficult to find, well, who or what is the problem. But yeah, thank you for that.
And can we give a good round of applause to Bridget?